October 8th, 1943, 28,000 feet over Bremen, Germany. The air at that altitude was thin, cold, and brutally honest. Aircraft that struggled down low flew even worse up here. Pilots sucked oxygen through masks that pinched their faces and turned voices into mechanical whispers. The sky, stretched between blinding sun above and a carpet of clouds below, belonged to whoever could still breathe, think and fight in air so thin it felt like drowning slowly. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp was breathing just fine. At least he thought he was. A veteran with over 200 kills, most of them earned in the savage skies over Russia, Philipp commanded Jägerschwader 1, one of the Luftwaffe's elite fighter units. He was the kind of pilot other men talked about in quiet tones, the kind whose name appeared in dispatches and whose tactics were studied by squadrons across the Reich. On the Eastern Front, he had faced waves of Soviet fighters flown by brave, but often poorly trained pilots in obsolete machines. He had learned to trust his instincts, his experience, and his aircraft. Today, leading his Focke-Wulf 190A-6 into position against an American B-17 formation, he felt that same confidence settle into his hands. Below him, the heavy bombers droned along in their tight defensive boxes, bristling with guns. Above and around them, like wasps circling a hive, American escort fighters weaved back and forth. P-47 Thunderbolts. Philipp had seen them before. He knew their reputation. Big, heavy, tough, hard to shoot down, armed with 8 machine guns that could turn an aircraft into confetti in seconds. But up here, at this altitude, in this thin air, they were supposed to struggle. German intelligence had said so. The reports from other units had confirmed it. The Thunderbolts were powerful at medium altitudes, but at 28,000 feet and above, the Germans still held the edge. Or so they thought. Philipp glanced at his instruments. His BMW 801 radial engine was running smoothly, but the gauges told a story he didn't like. Power output was dropping. The engine, so strong and reliable at lower altitudes, was gasping for oxygen. The supercharger, designed to compress the thin air and feed it into the cylinders, was working at its limit. Every few hundred feet higher made things a little worse. He keyed his radio and spoke to his wingmen, voice calm and professional. "Stay tight. We hit the bombers from above. One pass, then climb back out. The escorts are heavy. Don't let them drag you down." It was good advice, the kind that had kept him alive through hundreds of missions. The kind that assumed the escorts would behave the way escorts always behaved. Predictable, defensive, tied to the bombers like guard dogs on a leash. What Philipp didn't know, what none of the German pilots positioning for their attack run could have fully understood yet, was that the rules had changed. The P-47 pilots had learned. They had spent the summer of 1943 getting mauled, learning the hard way that trying to dogfight nimble German fighters was suicide. Their commanders had drilled new tactics into them. Stay high, use your weight, dive fast, hit hard, climb back out. Don't turn, don't chase, don't get cute. And critically, by October 1943, the Thunderbolts were being flown by men who had survived their first few missions and figured out how to stay alive. They were no longer the wide-eyed rookies who had arrived in April. They were becoming dangerous. High above the bombers, Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, 56th Fighter Group, flew his P-47 in a lazy, fuel-conserving weave. Johnson was a farm boy from Oklahoma, 22 years old, with a face that still looked young enough to get carded in a bar. But his eyes, scanning the sky with the kind of patience a hunter uses waiting for deer, belonged to someone older. He had already survived encounters that should have killed him. Just a few months earlier, he had brought his Thunderbolt home with over 200 bullet holes in it, damage that would have turned any other fighter into falling scrap. The experience had taught him something simple and brutal. The P-47 could take punishment, but only if you didn't give the enemy a clean shot in the first place. He saw the German formation positioning, dark specks sliding into attack geometry. He counted them quickly, at least a dozen Focke-Wulfs, maybe more. They were setting up for a classic bounce, diving from above with the sun behind them, using speed and surprise to rip through the bomber formation before the escorts could react. Johnson's squadron leader saw them too. His voice crackled over the radio, steady and cold. "Bandits high, 12 o'clock. Everybody up. Now." The P-47s climbed. Not gracefully, not like the sleek, nimble fighters in the propaganda films. They climbed like bulldozers pushing uphill, engines roaring, propellers clawing at air that didn't want to be caught. But they climbed. And up here, At an altitude where German fighters were supposed to dominate, something unexpected happened. The Thunderbolts kept their speed. The big Pratt & Whitney are 2,800 engines, force-fed by turbo superchargers that used exhaust gases to cram oxygen into the cylinders, didn't care that the air was thin. They kept delivering power. The P-47s kept accelerating. Philipp saw the American fighters climbing toward him and felt the first flicker of doubt. They shouldn't be doing that. Not this fast. Not this high. The reports had been clear. Above 25,000 feet, German fighters had the advantage. The Focke-Wulf and the Messerschmitt could outturn and outclimb anything the Allies had. Except the reports were wrong. The Thunderbolts didn't try to outturn the Germans. They didn't need to. They met them head-on, coming up from below with shocking speed, and suddenly the sky that had looked so controlled, so predictable, turned into chaos. Philipp committed. He rolled his Focke-Wulf into the attack dive, targeting AB-17 on the edge of the formation. His wingmen followed. Standard tactics. Hit fast, hit hard, climb back out before the escorts can react. It had worked 1,000 times before. It didn't work this time. As Philipp's fighter plunged toward the bombers, Robert Johnson's P-47 was already positioning. He didn't try to chase the diving German. That would have been suicide, a slow American fighter trying to catch a nimble attacker already at full speed. Instead, Johnson did what his training and his instincts told him to do. He waited. He watched Philipp's angle, calculated where the German would have to pull out after his attack, and pointed his Thunderbolt toward that empty piece of sky. Philipp fired. His cannon and machine guns raked the B-17, punching holes in wings and fuselage. Pieces flew. Smoke trailed. But the bomber held together, its defensive gunners already swinging their turrets toward him. He pulled hard on the stick, hauling the Focke-Wulf out of the dive and into a climbing turn, trying to regain altitude and speed. That was when Johnson struck. The P-47 came down like a freight train falling off a mountain. Johnson had rolled inverted, pulled through, and dove with everything the Thunderbolt had: 7 tons of aircraft, 2,000 horsepower, and gravity. His airspeed indicator climbed past numbers that would have terrified a test pilot. The wings shook. The controls stiffened. The world outside the canopy blurred into streaks of cloud and sky. Philipp never saw him. Johnson pulled the trigger at 300 yards. 8 Browning M2 machine guns fired simultaneously, each spitting out 12 rounds per second. The combined stream of fire, nearly 100 half-inch projectiles every second, carved through the air in a concentrated cone of destruction. The first rounds hit Philipp's Focke-Wulf along the left wing route. Armor-piercing incendiary bullets punched through aluminum skin, shattered structural members, and ignited fuel vapors. More rounds walked up the fuselage, tearing through the cockpit canopy, the engine cowling, the tail. In less than 2 seconds, the Focke-Wulf transformed from a sleek, deadly fighter into a disintegrating cloud of metal, fire, and smoke. Hans Philipp, one of Germany's best, a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on the eastern and western fronts, died instantly. His aircraft exploded. Witnesses on both sides reported seeing nothing left but fragments tumbling toward the clouds below. No parachute. No chance. Johnson pulled out of his dive, the Thunderbolt's massive airframe groaning under the G-forces, and climbed back toward the bomber formation. His combat report, filed hours later at the debriefing, was clinical and brief. Engaged enemy aircraft attacking bombers. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. But inside the cramped, vibrating cockpit of his P-47, in the seconds after Philipp's aircraft vanished, Johnson felt something heavier than adrenaline. He had just killed a man. Not an aircraft. Not a silhouette in a gun sight. A human being who, moments before, had been flying with the same confidence Johnson felt every time he strapped into his own fighter. Back at the German airfield, the loss of Hans Philipp sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. Pilots who had flown with him, who had trusted his judgment and followed his lead, struggled to process the news. If Philipp, with all his experience and skill, couldn't survive against the Thunderbolts, what chance did younger, less experienced pilots have? German intelligence scrambled to understand what had happened. The reports didn't make sense. Philipp had been at altitude, in his element, flying an aircraft specifically designed for high-altitude interception. The P-47s were supposed to be disadvantaged up there. Yet one of them had killed one of Germany's best aces in a matter of seconds. The answer, buried in technical data and combat reports, was simple but devastating. The Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger gave it performance at altitude that German fighters couldn't match. While the BMW and Daimler-Benz engines in German aircraft relied on mechanical superchargers that lost efficiency above 25,000 feet, the American fighter's exhaust-driven turbo system maintained sea-level power all the way up to 30,000 feet and beyond. In practical terms, this meant that at the altitudes where bomber formations flew, the P-47 was faster, could climb better, and had more energy to work with than anything the Luftwaffe could field. German pilots, trained to dominate the high ground, suddenly found themselves looking up at American fighters that shouldn't have been able to reach them. The psychological impact was immediate. Within weeks, Luftwaffe units began reporting a phenomenon their medical officers called altitude anxiety. Pilots who had fought without fear at medium altitudes became hesitant and cautious when ordered to intercept bombers above 25,000 feet. They knew the Thunderbolts would be waiting. They knew what those 8 guns could do. Hans Philipp's mistake wasn't tactical. He hadn't made an obvious error in judgment. He hadn't broken formation or ignored orders. His mistake was simpler and more fundamental. He had trusted outdated assumptions. He had believed the intelligence reports that said German fighters still owned the high sky. He had flown into combat confident that his experience and his aircraft would be enough. They weren't. In the months that followed, the P-47's reputation shifted from tough but limited to extremely dangerous at any altitude. German pilots developed new tactics to avoid engaging Thunderbolts unless absolutely necessary. They learned to attack bombers from angles that minimized exposure to escort fire. They learned to disengage the moment a P-47 dove on them, because staying in the fight meant death. But no amount of tactical adaptation could change the fundamental equation. The Americans had more pilots, more fuel, more ammunition, and more aircraft. Every P-47 lost could be replaced within days. Every pilot killed could be replaced by a fresh graduate from the massive training pipeline back in the States. Germany had none of those luxuries. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. By early 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was in crisis. The loss of men like Philipp, combined with relentless attrition from daily battles against numerically superior opponents, meant that the average skill level of German pilots was dropping fast. New pilots arrived at frontline units with less than 100 hours of total flight time, thrown into combat against Americans who had 4 times that much training. The legend of Hans Philipp lived on in Luftwaffe squadrons as both inspiration and warning. Inspiration, because he had been everything a fighter pilot was supposed to be: brave, skilled, relentless. Warning, because even men like him could die in an instant if they underestimated the enemy. Years after the war, in 1985, a reunion of German and American fighter pilots took place in the United States. Old men who had once tried to kill each other sat together, shared meals, and told stories. One of the German veterans, a former wingman of Philipp's, spoke quietly about that October day over Bremen. "Hans was the best of us," he said, voice steady but weighted with old grief. "He never made mistakes. But he made one that day. He believed what we all believed, that we still had the advantage at altitude. The Americans taught us otherwise. They didn't beat him because they were better pilots. They beat him because they had better machines and better tactics. And because we were too slow to adapt." Robert Johnson, by then an old man himself, listened quietly. He didn't boast. He didn't offer justification. He simply nodded and said, "War doesn't care who's best. It cares who's still flying at the end of the day." The story of Hans Philipp and Robert Johnson became a footnote in larger histories of the air war over Europe. But for those who study the details, who look beyond the statistics and the grand narratives, it remains a perfect example of how wars are won and lost. Not always through brilliance or cowardice. Sometimes through one mistake. The mistake of fighting yesterday's war with yesterday's assumptions while the enemy has already moved on to tomorrow. Hans Philipp made that mistake once. It was enough.